Coverdale Court, the South Library, in the soft Wiltshire afternoon of the 4th of November 1819. My dear Charlotte, I write to you what I have meant to write these 28 years, and have not had the patience to set down before the matter has required. Dr. Westbury of Salisbury has been at the long autumnal decline of his patience these 4 months. He gives me, in his careful Salisbury wisdom, until the close of December at the most. I shall ask Mr. Aubrey of High Street, Salisbury, to lay this letter at your hand at the Coverdale-on-the-Vale parsonage at his proper time after probate. You shall have heard of me only in passing. Your late uncle, Mr. Marmaduke Coverdale, was my own husband, Sir Geoffrey's younger brother. The two parted at Sir Geoffrey's marriage in 1788, my own father-in-law, the Reverend Augustus Coverdale, of Devizes, having taken in the matter the part I cannot now press the dust upon. By the will, Mr. Aubrey shall read at Salisbury. You are sole heiress to Coverdale Court, 158 acres, the walled south garden, the south orangery, the apple and pear orchard, the south library, the Coverdale family plate, and $3,300 in the 3%. I have followed your translation of the Eclogues these 4 years through Reverend Walpole Tregony's Gentle Sunday Accounts. The verse translations you have kept in the 3/4 notebooks are very fine, my dear Charlotte. Mr. Milman of Oxford holds the same opinion. I wish to think that the 1763 pine-press folio of Virgil at the South Library at Coverdale shall be at your hand from the spring of 1820 onwards. It has stood at the South Library writing table since my husband's brother Mr. Marmaduke obtained it from the pine sale in London in 1779. Mrs. Northmore at the housekeeper's keys, Mr. Verney at the home pasture, Mr. Sandys Hadley at the south door, and the Reverend Walpole Tregony at the parish living of St. Michael's. These shall receive you. They are honest and kind. I am sorry that I have not in your 28 years come over the 8 Wiltshire miles between us. The asking pardon of an old great-aunt at the close of her time is the only asking pardon at her hand to give. Your loving great-aunt, Philippa Coverdale. P.S. At the South Library writing table, you shall find my own annotated 1763 pine-press Virgil folio with my gentle italic at every eclogue, and my own 3/4 notebooks of an attempted Eclogue II, translation 1796-1810, left unfinished at my husband's death. They are for your hand. P.C. Wednesday the 22nd of December, 1819. The Wiltshire morning came down the Vale of Pewsey in plain December light, and the chalk downs to the south of the Coverdale on the Vale parsonage stood under a low sky the colour of pewter. A thin frost had laid itself over the parsonage south garden before the daylight had risen, and the holly at the south door still held the silver of it. Charlotte Coverdale was gentle 5'5", soft auburn hair plaited at the nape under a small lace cap, warm hazel eyes the colour of Wiltshire honey, fair Pewsey Vale complexion, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine for her late great-aunt the testatrix. She sat at the worn parsonage writing table at the south parlour window, the pine-press 1797 Virgil at her left hand, and her own quarto notebook, the second open at her right. She was finishing the verse translation of Eclogue Guffaws. The line at her quill was the 16th, Ille Deum vita videbit, and she had set it in English, as he shall behold the life of gods, and in the careful margin of the quarto notebook she had written the Latin once again in her plain hand for the parallel reading. The notebook was the second of the 3 she'd kept since 1815. Eclogues I through Ives at the first, V through 7th at the second's later pages, Theta through X at the third. The quill was a goose feather from Mr. Verney of the Vale of Pewsey, sent across at Michaelmas by the Marlborough carrier, and the ink, the plain iron gall the Salisbury stationer kept for the parsonage account. The parsonage at Coverdale on the Vale of Pewsey was a low honeystone house of 2 stories at the lane south of St. Michael's, with a tiled porch and a slate roof, and the parish glebe of 7 acres at the back. Reverend Hadrian Coverdale, her widowed father, had been curate of St. Michael's since 1798. Her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Pusey Coverdale, had died at her birth in 1791. The house had its parlour at the south, its kitchen and dairy at the east, its study and small library at the west, and at the upper floor, the 4 small chambers in the Wiltshire parsonage fashion of the last century. The parlour clock at the chimney-piece struck 10:30, and Charlotte heard at the lane the iron rim of a hired chaise come down from the Marlborough turnpike. The chaise was a Salisbury one. She knew it at the wheel note before she had crossed to the window, and it drew up at the south door of the parsonage in the plain December manner of a man on settled business. Mr. Aubrey of Salisbury was 60, gold spectacles, plain dark wool. He came down at the parsonage step with a black leather dispatch case at his hand. He had been her late great-aunt's solicitor these 11 years, and probate at the will of Mrs. Philippa Coverdale of Coverdale Court had been granted at the Salisbury consistory the Friday previous. Charlotte rose and went out at the parsonage hall, and Hannah, the parsonage maid, had already opened the south door at his hand. Reverend Hadrian, her father, had come down from the west study with his plain black coat over his cassock, the small ribbon at the collar he kept for parish callers. The two received Mr. Aubrey at the south parlour, and Hannah brought up the tea-tray with the parsonage china and the plain seed cake the parsonage kept for Wednesdays. Mr. Aubrey had, at the parsonage hall, taken off the plain dark wool greatcoat at Hannah's hand and laid the black beaver hat at the hall table beside the dispatch case. He stepped into the south parlour at the slow, plain pace of a Salisbury man of business who has been at this office 60 years and knows that haste does not become a will-reading at a country parsonage at the close of December. He bowed at Reverend Hadrian Coverdale at the parlour door, bowed at Miss Coverdale at the south window, and laid the dispatch case at the parsonage table. Hannah set the tea at the parlour table and withdrew at the hall door without a word, as Reverend Hadrian had instructed her at the morning when the Salisbury chaise had been sent word of. The parsonage cat, the one Mrs. Hadrian had kept since 1817, had taken itself out at the kitchen at the chaise wheel and did not come back at the south parlour. Mr. Aubrey set the dispatch case at the parsonage table and opened it. He drew up from the case a sealed letter at the head, and at the seal the plain wax cipher of Mrs. Philippa Coverdale, P.C., and the small Coverdale crest of the 3 pairs was still entire. He laid the letter at the parsonage table at Charlotte's hand, and said in his settled Salisbury manner that the late Mrs. Coverdale had asked, at her own particular instruction, that he should read the letter aloud at the parsonage in her hearing and at her father's hearing. Charlotte sat at the parlour chair by the south window. Her father stood at the parlour door. Mr. Aubrey broke the seal at the plain manner of a man who has done such an office many times, took up the gold spectacles to the nose, and read. He read the date and the address. He read the salutation. He read through to the end, the 28 years, Dr. Westbury, the will at Salisbury, the 158 acres, and the walled south garden, and the orangery, and the orchard, and the south library, and the family plate, and the $3,300 in the 3%, the Eclogues these 4 years, through Reverend Walpole Tregony's accounts, the pine press folio at the south library writing table, the 4 servants, and the parish curate, the 8 Wiltshire miles, the asking pardon. He read the closing and the signature. He read the postscript at the annotated folio, and the 3 unfinished quarto notebooks of Mrs. Philippa's own attempted Eclogue II translation, 1796, 1810. At the close of the reading, he laid the letter at the parsonage table at Charlotte's hand, and was silent. Reverend Hadrian Coverdale at the parlour door said nothing. He had taken from the doorpost the plain Wiltshire silence of a curate who has heard a thing at the 28 years' remove, and shall not at the first hearing set it down in any other manner. Charlotte sat at the parlour chair, and was silent also. She had not at the 28 years of her own remembering been at Coverdale Court. She had heard of Mrs. Philippa Coverdale at the parsonage only in the plain Wiltshire passing mention of a parish curate's daughter, whose late great-aunt was at the manor at the 8 miles east, a name at a Sunday account, a date at a parish register, a small remembrance at her father's plain December prayers. The letter at Mr. Aubrey's hand had set the matter at the parsonage table in a manner the plain Wiltshire passing mention had not. Then she took up the letter at her own hand, read it over once at the plain Wiltshire daylight from the south window, folded it at its first crease, and laid it at the parlour table. Mr. Aubrey then drew up from the dispatch case the 6 items the will had appointed. The first was the copy of the will itself, 11 pages in Mr. Aubrey's clerk's plain hand, the schedule of the 158 acres, and the south orangery and the apple and pear orchard, and the plate of 80 pieces at the Salisbury 1789 mark, and the south library of 392 volumes, the 3300 in the 3%, the 4 servants named at the 2nd page, the parish living and the parish curate at the 3rd, the executors at the 11th. Mr. Aubrey laid it at the parsonage table at Charlotte's hand. The second was a brass ring of 5 keys at a plain length of black ribbon. The keys were the south door, the south library, the south orangery, the plate chest, and the muniment room. Mr. Aubrey laid the ring at the parsonage table at Charlotte's hand, and the brass at the December daylight had the dull, warm tone of plate that has been at a Wiltshire housekeeper's keeping these 40 years. The third was a banker's draft at Hawes of Fleet Street for 3,300 sterling, drawn at the 3% stock and made out at the order of Miss Charlotte Coverdale of Coverdale on the Vale of Pewsey Parsonage, Wiltshire, dated the 18th December 1819, countersigned at the Salisbury branch the Tuesday previous. Mr. Aubrey laid it at the parsonage table. The fourth was the calling card of Reverend Walpole Tregony, curate of St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale, with at the verso a written line in his plain hand, "I shall wait at the south door of Coverdale Court at Miss Coverdale's arrival. R.W.T." Mr. Aubrey laid it at the parsonage table. The fifth was the calling card of Lord Percival Aubrey Walpole, 5th Baron Walpole of Walpole Court, Wiltshire, lay patron of the Coverdale living, with at the verso a written line in his plain hand. At Miss Coverdale's settled time, Walpole. Mr. Aubrey laid it at the parsonage table. The 6th was a second sealed letter, the wax again the small PC, cipher and the 3 pairs, the direction at the face in Mrs. Philippa Coverdale's own hand, to the Reverend Hadrian Coverdale, curate of St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale, at the parsonage at the proper time after Mr. Aubrey's reading. Mr. Aubrey laid the letter at her father's hand at the parlour door. The 6 items lay at the parsonage south parlour table at the December daylight from the south window. The will, the brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon, the 3,300 draft at Hawes, the calling card of Reverend Walpole Tregony, the calling card of Lord Walpole, and the second sealed mourning letter at her father's hand. Mr. Aubrey then said his settled instruction. The Salisbury chambers at High Street should be at Miss Coverdale's command at any morning of the Christmas week. If she would write at her own hand at Monday the 27th December, next her acceptance at the will, and her appointed day at the arrival at Coverdale Court, he should at the Salisbury post Tuesday send word at Mrs. Northmore the housekeeper, and at Mr. Sandys Hadley the butler, and at Mr. Verney the steward, and at Reverend Walpole Tregony the parish curate. The 5 keys would then be at her hand at the south door at the appointed day. He drank the tea Hannah had set at his hand, ate a small portion of the seed cake, and at the close of his 2nd cup took his leave. Reverend Hadrian saw him out at the south door. The hired chaise drew off at the lane in the December manner of a Salisbury solicitor at his 2nd call of a country morning. Reverend Hadrian Coverdale came back at the south parlour and stood at the parsonage table. He took up the sealed mourning letter Mrs. Philippa had sent at his own hand. He looked at the wax, at the small PC cipher and the 3 pairs, at the direction in Mrs. Philippa's own hand. He drew the small black silk ribbon at his cassock pocket, set the letter at the parlour table, took up the silver paper knife at the chimney-piece and broke the seal. He stood at the south window and read in plain Wiltshire silence. Charlotte sat at the parlour chair and did not look at his face. The plain December daylight came in at the south window, across the seed cake plate and the brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon and the 3300 draft and the 2 calling cards. At the close of the reading, her father folded the letter, laid it at his cassock pocket, set his hand once at her shoulder, and went out at the parlour door to the west study without a word. Charlotte sat at the parlour chair a long while at the south window. Then she rose, set the 6 items at the parsonage writing table, the will at the head, the keys at the right, the draft at the left, the 2 cards at the centre, her own letter at the foot, and went out at the parlour to the small kitchen garden at the east of the parsonage where Hannah had set the chickens. She walked the kitchen garden path twice. The hens at the east coop took up the small parsonage clucking they kept for any step at the path, and Charlotte did not stop at the coop, but went on at the south wall and at the small parish glebe gate and back at the parsonage south door. The 8 Wiltshire miles between Coverdale on the Vale parsonage and Coverdale Court at the east lay over the chalk-down road in the plain December manner, and she had, at the 28 years of her own life, not been at the 8 miles for any matter. The asking pardon at her late great-aunt's letter had set the 8 miles at the parsonage table at the south parlour at the December daylight, and the asking pardon was at her hand to take up or to set down. She came back at the south parlour at the close of the afternoon, set the small candle at the parsonage writing table, opened the pine press 1797 Virgil at Eclogue the 4 at the parchment marker she had laid at the morning, took up her quill, and finished the verse translation she had left at the lean Il Deum Vita Videbit. She had at the morning left the verse translation at the 16th line. The Eclogue ran on at 27 lines past it, and the pastoral measure she had set herself at her own English iambics required the full close of the poem before she should, at the day's end, set down the journal entry the Bible of her own settled practice had appointed. She set the last 6 lines of the Eclogue in plain English at the right-hand page of the quarto notebook. The pastoral measure she kept in its English iambics. The long Virgilian period at the close she set in 3 sentences at the parallel manner. The small invocation at the line 9 of the close she kept at its Latin first and at her English second. She set the quill at the inkstand, dusted the page with the small pounce pot, and at the bottom of the right-hand page wrote in her plain hand the journal entry the Bible had appointed of her. Eclogue 4. Ille Deum Vita Videbit. Wed 22nd December, 1819. Coverdale on the Vale Parsonage, South Parlour. Mr. Aubrey's letter at the South Parlour this afternoon. She blotted the page, set the quarto notebook at the parsonage writing table beside the pine press Virgil, drew the small candle nearer, and sat at the south window in the closing Wiltshire dusk. The brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon lay at the parsonage writing table at her left hand, and at the candle the dull metal had taken the small amber light of the parsonage tallow. She did not at the dusk take the ring up. She set her own hand at the closed pine press 1797 Virgil at her right, and let it rest at the cover, and at the parsonage south window the December evening came on in plain Wiltshire silence. The Monday following, the 27th December 1819, she sat at the parsonage writing table at the south parlour, and at her own plain hand wrote at Mr. Aubrey of High Street, Salisbury. She accepted the bequest at the will, accepted the appointment at the 6 items, named her appointed day at the arrival at Coverdale Court at Saturday, the 8th of January 1820, and asked that he should at the Salisbury post Tuesday send word at Mrs. Northmore, the housekeeper, and at Mr. Sandys Hadley, the butler, and at Mr. Verney, the steward, and at Reverend Walpole Tregony, the parish curate. She signed the letter, Charlotte Coverdale at the parsonage of Coverdale on the Vale of Pewsey, sealed it at the small Coverdale parsonage seal her father kept at the west study, and sent it at the Marlborough post that afternoon at the parsonage boy. She wrote at the second sheet a short note at Reverend Walpole Tregony at the parish living of Coverdale on the Vale, in the plain Wiltshire, hand the parish curate would know, at the first glance, that she should be at Coverdale Court the Saturday, the 8th of January 1820, and that she should be at St. Michael's the Sunday, the 9th of January 1820, at his parish service. She sealed it at the same small Coverdale seal, and sent it at the same Marlborough post. She wrote at the third sheet a short note at Lord Walpole at Walpole Court, Wiltshire. In the plain hand, the lay patron of the parish living was owed at his calling card, to say that she had received at her hand his lay patron card at the parsonage, and that she should be at Coverdale Court the Saturday, the 8th of January 1820, in her late great-aunt's appointed manner. She did not say more. She sealed it at the same small Coverdale seal, and sent it at the same Marlborough post. The Marlborough post boy took the 3 letters at the parsonage door at the close of the afternoon. Charlotte stood at the south door, and watched him take the lane south at the chalk-down road in the plain Wiltshire manner of a December dusk. Then she came back at the south parlour, set the brass ring of 5 keys at the parsonage writing table beside the quarto notebook of Eclogue IV, and the pine press 1797 Virgil, and sat at the small candle at the south window a long while. Her father came down at the west study at the close of the evening, and the two sat at the parlour fire at the seed cake plate and the parsonage tea, and Reverend Hadrian Coverdale set his hand once at her hand, and said only in his plain Wiltshire manner that her late great-aunt's letter had been at his own asking pardon at the 28 years between, and that he would at her appointed day, the 8th January 1820, see her at Coverdale Court, at the south door, and at her settled inheritance at the will. He said nothing more of the contents of the letter at his cassock pocket. Charlotte did not ask. The parlour fire burned down at the small hearth. The brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon lay at the parsonage writing table at the candle. The pine press 1797 Virgil lay open at the Eclogue of Falls. The quarto notebook lay beside it at the line Il Deum vita videbit, and the journal entry below. The Wiltshire night came down at the south window in the plain December manner of the Vale of Pewsey. Saturday, the 8th of January, 1820 came in the settled Wiltshire fashion of a January morning that has come to a quiet purpose. The frost lay thin upon the south parlour sill of the Coverdale on the Vale parsonage. The chalk-down air carried the long, honey-coloured stillness of the Vale of Pewsey at the close of the night, and the small parsonage stable-yard had been at its proper work since the gentle hour before dawn. The Reverend Hadrian Coverdale stood at the south parlour door in his plain dark wool, his Sunday cravat folded with the quiet care he had always given the matter, and Charlotte Coverdale at the parlour table closed her writing case at the brass clasp and laid it at the small black travelling trunk her father had bought at Devizes the week before. She wore her settled black mourning gabardine for her late great-aunt the testatrix, a small black bonnet of plain crape, and her soft auburn hair was plaited at the nape under a small lace cap. Mrs. Pewsey of the parsonage kitchen had wrapped the cold parsonage breakfast in clean Wiltshire linen, and the small parsonage gig stood at the gate with the Coverdale grey at the trace, the breath of the Coverdale grey rising in the still January air. The Reverend Hadrian gave his daughter his blessing at the south parlour door in the quiet Wiltshire manner he had kept all the 28 years of her life, laid his hand briefly upon her sleeve, and walked with her to the gate. Mr. Verney's man from Coverdale Court was at the bridle of the Coverdale chaise behind the gig. Mr. Verney himself had sent down the chaise the evening before with 2 of the Coverdale greys, and the man held the door at the parsonage gate in plain Coverdale livery. The small black travelling trunk was set at the rack. Charlotte gave her father her hand at the chaise step, took her seat upon the dark wool cushion within, drew the small Coverdale travelling rug across her knees, and the chaise drew out of the parsonage gate in the steady Wiltshire fashion of a Saturday morning. The road from Coverdale on the Vale ran east along the Vale of Pewsey, 8 miles to the parish of Coverdale Court, by way of the Bear at Devizes, where the Coverdale chaise drew up at the inn-yard at the proper hour for the change of horses. The Bear stood at the corner of the Devizes Market Square, in the long honey-coloured Wiltshire stone of the country, the inn-yard kept in the settled manner of the Devizes house, and the Coverdale chaise was given the small inn-parlour at the south side. The landlord brought up a plate of cold Wiltshire ham, the small pot of Devizes tea, and the plain loaf of the Devizes bread, and Charlotte took the small refreshment in the quiet manner of a journey settled before it has begun. The change of horses was made within the half-hour at the inn-yard. The 2 fresh Coverdale greys were brought out from the inn-stable, and the chaise drew out of the Bear at Devizes in the steady Wiltshire manner the journey had set itself from the parsonage gate. The road eastward of Devizes lay along the chalk shoulder of the Vale, the long honey-coloured fields of the Pewsey country opening at the south, and the chaise came up at the lodge gate of Coverdale Court at the gentle close of the Wiltshire afternoon. The lodge stood at the western edge of the home pasture of Coverdale Court, the lodge-keeper's wife at the gate in plain Wiltshire wool, and the chaise drew along the honey-coloured gravel of the south drive between the long line of the Coverdale elms. The Coverdale honeystone of the south front rose at the close of the drive in the settled 2-storey fashion of the country house Sir Geoffrey Coverdale's father had built in 1750, the pale tile roof set close at the gable, the south door open at the gentle Wiltshire afternoon, and 3 figures stood at the south step in the settled fashion of a household that had been at its proper work since the gentle hour of the morning. The chaise drew up at the south step. Mr. Verney's man held the chaise door. Mrs. Pewsey of the parsonage kitchen had handed up at the parsonage gate the small Wiltshire wicker basket of clean linen for the journey, and Charlotte set her foot upon the south step of Coverdale Court for the first hour of her life. Mr. Sandys Hadley, the Coverdale butler of 58 years, settled Wiltshire service, came forward in his plain dark wool with the soft formality of the south door, and said only that the Coverdale household stood at her hand at the south step of Coverdale Court at the gentle Wiltshire close of the Saturday afternoon. Mrs. Northmore, the Coverdale housekeeper of 56 years, and the lace cap and plum bombazine of her settled office, gave the quiet curtsy of the south door, and said only that the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale had left the South Library at Coverdale, at the proper readiness for Miss Coverdale's arrival on the Saturday morning. Mr. Verney, the Coverdale steward of 60 weathered Wiltshire years in the plain dark coat of his office, gave the settled bow of the south door, and said only that the home pasture and the south orchard stood at her hand at her proper convenience. Mr. Sandys Hadley handed her in at the south door. The honey-coloured stone of the south hall received the gentle Wiltshire afternoon at the long line of its 3 south windows, the Coverdale family arms set above the south hall fireplace in plain Salisbury plaster, the Coverdale pale tile roof reaching above the settled stone of the south staircase. Mrs. Northmore handed her at the south staircase to the long upper gallery of the south wing, and from the south gallery turning to the south library, at the southeast corner of the upper floor, where the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale had kept her settled writing, at the south library writing table these 31 years past. The south library opened at the gentle Wiltshire afternoon at 3 south windows, and the long honey-coloured shelves of the Coverdale books lined the west wall and the east wall and the north wall, at the long settled fashion the south library had kept since 1750. The settled inventory of Coverdale Court stood at Mr. Aubrey's plain Salisbury figure. 158 acres of the home pasture and the south orchard, and the walled south garden and the south orangery, 392 volumes at the long shelves of the south library, 80 pieces of the Coverdale family plate of the Salisbury maker of 1789, and £3,300 in the 3% at the settled Salisbury fashion of the Coverdale estate. Mr. Verney had set out the tenant rolls of the home pasture at the South Library writing table. Mrs. Northmore had set out the house books of the Coverdale household at the South Library writing table. Mr. Sandys Hadley had set out the plate book of the Coverdale family plate at the South Library writing table. And Mr. Aubrey of High Street, Salisbury, had set out his Salisbury copy of the late Mrs. Philippa's will at the South Library writing table at the gentle Wiltshire close of the December before. The plate book set out the 80 pieces at the Salisbury Maker's Mark of 1789, the Coverdale tea service, the Coverdale salvers, the Coverdale candlesticks, and the Coverdale ladles. And the tenant rolls set out the home pasture at the south side of the estate, at the Pusey Vale tenancies the Coverdales had kept these 70 years past. The south windows of the South Library opened upon the long Wiltshire prospect of the Vale of Pusey, the honey-coloured fields of the home pasture lying at the close of the South Garden and the South Orangery, the long honey-coloured ribbon of the Pusey country reaching to the south, and the chalk downs rising further south at the long settled fashion of the Wiltshire country at the close of the afternoon. The long honey-coloured shoulder of the southern down stood at the soft Wiltshire close of the day at the south-east corner of the prospect, and the Vale of Pusey opened south of the South Garden in the long settled fashion of the country the Coverdales had kept at the south windows of Coverdale Court these 70 years past. Charlotte stood at the South Library writing table, where the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale had kept her settled writing these 31 years, and laid her hand upon the 1763 pine-press folio of Virgil at the South Library writing table, and at the 3 unfinished quarto notebooks of her late great-aunt's verse translation of Eclogue II, 1796-1810, laid beside the pine-press folio in the settled Wiltshire fashion. Her late great-aunt had set them out at the close of the November before. Mrs. Northmore came up at the South Library door and brought up the worn green calf commonplace book of the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale at the gentle Wiltshire close of the afternoon, and laid it at the South Library writing table at the settled fashion the late Mrs. Philippa had kept it these 31 years. Charlotte gave Mrs. Northmore the quiet thanks of the South Library door, and Mrs. Northmore went down at the South Library stair to the housekeeper's office of the South Wing in the settled Wiltshire manner of the Coverdale household. The pine-press folio lay open at Eclogue 4 at the South Library writing table, the careful italic of the late Mrs. Philippa at the margin of every eclogue of the pine-press folio, and the 3 unfinished quarto notebooks of Eclogue the same, 1796-1810, lay at the right hand of the pine-press folio at the South Library writing table, where the late Mrs. Philippa had kept them these 10 years past her husband's death in 1810. Charlotte laid her own dark travelling pen at the South Library writing table beside the pine-press folio, set her small Coverdale travelling case of the parsonage upon the plain Wiltshire floor at the South Library writing table, and sat down at the late Mrs. Philippa's settled chair at the South Library writing table for the first hour of her settled tenancy at Coverdale Court. The first Sunday at St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale of Pusey was held in the gentle Wiltshire fashion of the parish church the Reverend Walpole Tregony had kept these 7 years past, the lay patron of the living the Walpole family of Walpole Court, 10 miles north on the chalk downs above Pusey, and Charlotte sat in the Coverdale family pew at the south side of the nave, in her settled black gabardine and small crape bonnet for the plain country service the Reverend Walpole Tregony gave from the plain Wiltshire pulpit of the parish church. The Coverdale household settled at its proper work in the settled Wiltshire fashion the late Mrs. Philippa had kept these 31 years past. Mr. Sandys Hadley kept the south door and the south hall at the settled formality of his 58 years Wiltshire service. Mrs. Northmore kept the housekeeper's office at the south wing, at the settled fashion of her 56 years. Mr. Verney walked the home pasture and the south orchard at the proper Wiltshire hours of the country morning. Mrs. Northmore's niece, Miss Phoebe Northmore, came up at the South Library in the quiet Wiltshire fashion of a reading companion of 24 years, and gave Charlotte the settled order of the house books at the South Library writing table, at the gentle Wiltshire fashion her aunt had taught her these 6 years past. Charlotte took her settled writing at the South Library writing table at the afternoon hours her late great-aunt had kept these 31 years past, the 1763 pine-press folio at her hand, and the 3 unfinished quarto notebooks of Eclogue de Thou at her right hand at the settled fashion. The late Mrs. Philippa had set them out at the South Library writing table of Coverdale Court. The Wiltshire afternoon came in at the 3 south windows of the South Library, at the long honey-coloured fashion of the chalk country, the settled Wiltshire stillness of the South Library, laid upon the long honey-coloured shelves of the Coverdale books, and the soft Wiltshire hours of the Vale of Pewsey kept their steady pace at the south windows of Coverdale Court. Upon the Wednesday following the Saturday of her arrival, Sir Roderick Bridges of Bridges Hall, near Devizes, dropped his calling card at the south door of Coverdale Court by the hand of his clerk in plain Devizes wool. Sir Roderick Bridges was the 4th Baronet Bridges of Bridges Hall, near Devizes, 55, stout, gout-flushed, of the primrose silk waistcoat and oily smile of his settled Devizes manner, and his clerk laid the calling card at the south door with a folded note of plain Devizes, wove paper sealed at the small Bridges seal. The folded note announced, in the settled Devizes formality of Sir Roderick's clerk's hand, the request of Sir Roderick Bridges for a private interview at the South Library of Coverdale Court upon the Wednesday following at the proper Wiltshire hour of the country morning. Mr. Sandys Hadley took the calling card and the folded note at the south door, gave the clerk the formal acknowledgment of the south door, and brought up the calling card and the folded note at the South Library in the settled Wiltshire fashion of his 58 years' service. Charlotte received the calling card and the folded note at the South Library writing table in the settled Wiltshire composure her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Pusey Coverdale, had taught her at the parsonage these 28 years past. She laid the calling card and the folded note upon the South Library writing table beside the 1763 pine-press folio of Virgil and the 3 unfinished quarto notebooks of Eclogue de Thou, and she gave Mr. Sandys Hadley the quiet thanks of the South Library at the settled Wiltshire fashion of the South Library door. She read the folded note again at the South Library writing table in the settled fashion her late great-aunt had taught her at the South Library writing table in the November letter from Coverdale. The folded note set out the request of Sir Roderick Bridges of Bridges Hall in the proper Devizes formality of Sir Roderick's clerk's hand, that Sir Roderick should be permitted the private interview at the South Library of Coverdale Court upon the Wednesday following at the proper Wiltshire hour of the morning, upon a matter of Wiltshire concern between the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale of Coverdale Court and Sir Roderick Bridges of Bridges Hall, as the same had stood at the gentle autumn of 1818. The folded note set out no further matter at the Devizes formality of its hand, and the folded note was sealed at the small Bridges seal of plain dark wax at the settled Devizes fashion. Charlotte laid the folded note upon the South Library writing table beside the calling card, took her own settled writing pen at the South Library writing table, and at the quiet Wiltshire afternoon of the Wednesday, she wrote out in her settled hand a plain letter to Mr. Aubrey of High Street, Salisbury, enclosing the calling card of Sir Roderick Bridges of Bridges Hall and the folded note of Sir Roderick's clerk, and setting out at the settled fashion of her late great-aunt's settled instruction that the matter of Sir Roderick Bridges of Bridges Hall should be laid at Mr. Aubrey's hand at the proper Salisbury fashion before the Wednesday following. She sealed the letter at the small Coverdale seal of plain dark wax at the settled Wiltshire fashion of the South Library, laid the letter at the South Library writing table, and gave the letter to Mr. Sandys Hadley at the South Library door at the evening hour of the Wednesday for the evening post out of Coverdale on the Vale to High Street, Salisbury. Mr. Sandys Hadley took the letter at the South Library door in the settled Wiltshire fashion of his settled office, gave the formal acknowledgment of the South Library door, and the letter went down at the south staircase to the South Hall and out at the south door to the small Coverdale post-boy at the south step at the proper evening hour of the Wednesday for the Salisbury Evening Post. The letter went out of Coverdale on the Vale at the close of the Wednesday, in the settled fashion the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale had set out at the South Library writing table at the November of 1819. The South Library at the south windows kept the settled Wiltshire stillness of the close of the Wednesday afternoon. The Vale of Pewsey opened south of the South Garden at the long honey-coloured fashion of the chalk country. The chalk downs rose further south at the long-settled fashion of the Wiltshire country at the close of the Wednesday. Charlotte sat at the South Library writing table at the settled chair her late great-aunt had kept at the South Library writing table these 31 years past, and she took up the 1763 pine-press folio of Virgil at the South Library writing table at the Eclogue or Fauve. The late Mrs. Philippa's careful italic had marked at the margin in the autumn of the year before. She read the careful italic of her late great-aunt's hand at the margin of Eclogue the Fauve in the gentle Wiltshire close of the Wednesday afternoon at the South Library of Coverdale Court, and the settled Wiltshire stillness of the South Library, laid upon the long honey-coloured shelves of the Coverdale books at the close of the Wednesday afternoon. The Coverdale household kept its proper Wiltshire pace at the south wing through the close of the week and the Sunday following. Mrs. Northmore kept the housekeeper's office at the south wing at the settled fashion of her office. Mr. Verney walked the home pasture and the south orchard at the proper Wiltshire hours of the country morning. Mr. Sandys Hadley kept the south door and the south hall at the settled formality of his office. Miss Phoebe Northmore came up at the South Library at the proper afternoon hour, with the settled order of the Coverdale house books at the South Library writing table. The Reverend Walpole Tregony came up at the South Library at the quiet Wiltshire afternoon of the Friday following the Wednesday, and gave Charlotte the settled greeting of the parish living of St. Michael's at the South Library door at the gentle Wiltshire fashion of the parish curate. The settled Wiltshire stillness of the South Library kept at the South Library writing table at the close of the week, and the long honey-coloured shelves of the Coverdale books kept their settled silence at the quiet close of the Wiltshire days. The 1763 pine-press folio of Virgil at the South Library writing table kept the careful italic of the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale at the margin of every eclogue at the settled fashion her own hand had set out these 31 years past at the South Library writing table of Coverdale Court. The 3 unfinished quarto notebooks of Eclogue II, 1796–1810, kept their settled silence at the right hand of the pine-press folio at the South Library writing table at the quiet Wiltshire close of the week, the Wednesday following. The Wednesday of Sir Roderick Bridges's calling card stood at the settled hour of the country morning ahead. Wednesday the 19th of January. 1820 came over the Vale of Pewsey in a thin Wiltshire light along the chalk downs. The frost had held at the south orangery glass through the night and at the brick walks of the walled south garden, and the rooks above the home pasture were at their morning quarrel, and the smoke at the South Library chimney rose straight in the still air. Charlotte Coverdale was at the South Library writing table in her unrelieved black mourning gabardine, with her small lace cap plain at the nape of her plaited auburn hair, and the pine-press 1763 folio of Virgil at her hand, opened at Eclogue 6, and her own third quarto notebook of an English verse translation of the Eclogues open beside it at the same page, and the inkstand and the steel pen and the brass blotter set out at her right hand in the Wiltshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept at this writing-table for 30 years. Mr. Aubrey of High Street, Salisbury, had come up from Salisbury the evening before. He had taken Mrs. Northmour's offered south chamber, and at breakfast he had folded his gold spectacles and observed that the matter of Sir Roderick Bridges should be at the South Library at the proper Wiltshire hour. He had said no more than that. He had been the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale's man of business 28 years, and his Salisbury wisdom in matters of will and trust and parole claim was at Charlotte's hand the more for being undeclared. The Reverend Walpole Tregony of St. Michael's of Coverdale-on-the-Vale had come over from the parsonage at the proper morning hour. He was in his plain black gown, and he had taken the South Library chair to the left of the writing-table at Mr. Aubrey's direction, and he had brought his Greek Testament and laid it at his knee in the silence that was his proper Wiltshire manner. He had baptized Mrs. Philippa's husband's elder sister at this parish in 1789, and he had buried Mrs. Philippa at the South Transept in the December past, and his presence at the South Library this morning was at Mr. Aubrey's settled instruction the second disinterested witness the matter required. Mrs. Northmour had set out the small tray of Salisbury sherry and the plain-cut glasses at the side table by the south window. She had brought up the brass coal-scuttle and laid the fire at the South Library hearth at the early Wiltshire morning, and she had set up the writing-stand at Charlotte's left hand with the Le Maire 1817 Tibullus brought up from the small box of books at the south chamber. She had drawn the Wiltshire chintz half across the south window, so the morning light should fall at Charlotte's right shoulder and not at her face. She had then withdrawn at Mr. Aubrey's nod to the housekeeper's room beyond the green baize door, and the South Library at the writing-table held only the three at the table and the steady tick of the long case clock at the north wall. Mr. Aubrey adjusted his gold spectacles and looked at Charlotte across the writing-table. "Sir Roderick Bridges," he said, by his clerk's folded note of Wednesday last, sets out a parole claim of the September of 1818. He shall come with his barrister, Mr. Inchbald of Lincoln's Inn. The matter is to be heard in your hearing, Miss Coverdale, at the South Library writing-table of Coverdale Court, by Mr. Aubrey of Salisbury for the estate, and Reverend Walpole Tregony of St. Michael's, as disinterested witness. You shall hear his claim through. You shall make your reply at your own settled hand, and you shall not be pressed at the matter beyond your own readiness. Do I have your understanding?" "You have my understanding, Mr. Aubrey," Charlotte said. "You have at the writing-table the Pine Press 1763 Virgil folio that stood at your late great-aunt's hand." "I have, Mr. Aubrey." "You have your third quarto notebook of English verse translation." "I have, Mr. Aubrey, opened at Eclogue 6. "You have the Le Maire 1817 Tibullus." "I have, Mr. Aubrey. The small octavo at the writing-stand at my left hand, opened at Book 2, Poem 6. Then we shall await Sir Roderick at the south door." Charlotte set the steel pen back at the inkstand. She closed her own quarto notebook at the page with a thin slip of plain Wiltshire writing paper laid at the place. She laid her hand at the half-title of the Pine Press 1763 folio, where her late great-aunt's gentle italic had set down P. Coverdale, Coverdale Court, the 4th of August 1779, by Mr. Marmaduke Coverdale's gift from the Pine Sale in London. She did not weep at the italic. She had read it 16 times at the South Library writing-table since the 8th of January, and she had set down at her commonplace, book at her own hand, each reading. She had, at this morning, the steady Wiltshire composure of one who has read at her own hand the matter the morning required. Mr. Sandys Hadley at the south door opened to Sir Roderick's barouche at 11 of the clock. Charlotte heard the wheels at the gravel, the silence at the wheels, the south door at Mr. Sandys Hadley's hand, the steady step at the flagged passage. Mr. Sandys Hadley announced at the South Library door, "Sir Roderick Bridges of Bridges Hall." he said, and Mr. Inchbald of Lincoln's Inn. Sir Roderick Bridges, 55, stout 5'10", gout-flushed, primrose silk waistcoat, oily smile. He came in at the South Library door with the manner of his usage in the devisers' assembly rooms. "Miss Coverdale," he said, "Sir Roderick Bridges of Bridges Hall, your servant." Mr. Inchbald, his barrister, thin grey, charcoal wool, plain steel spectacles. He carried a plain black portfolio under his left arm. "Inchbald," he said, "of Lincoln's Inn, for Sir Roderick." Mr. Aubrey rose at the writing table. The Reverend Walpole Tregony rose at the chair by the writing table. Charlotte inclined her head at the gentle Wiltshire degree, no more, no less, and did not rise. The South Library at the writing table was at her own hand, and at her late great-aunt's settled appointment, and she was the heiress of Coverdale Court, at the will of Mrs. Philippa Coverdale, by Mr. Aubrey's reading at High Street, Salisbury, and the rising at the South Library writing table was not at her part to perform. "Sir Roderick," Mr. Aubrey said. "Mr. Inchbald, Mr. Aubrey of High Street, Salisbury, for the estate of the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale. The Reverend Walpole Tregony of St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale as disinterested witness. Miss Coverdale shall hear your matter at her own writing table. Pray be seated." Sir Roderick took the offered chair at the south side of the writing table and laid his gold-headed cane at the floor at his right knee. Mr. Inchbald drew the second chair at his shoulder and laid the plain black portfolio at his knee and unfastened the brass clasp at the portfolio with his thin grey hand and drew out a folded paper of 3 sheets sewn at the left margin with the plain black silk of the Lincoln's Inn fashion. "Miss Coverdale," Mr. Inchbald said, "by instruction of Sir Roderick Bridges of Bridges Hall, Sir Roderick advances a parole trust set up at the South Library of Coverdale Court in the September of 1818 by the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale, in his favour, in respect of the South Orangery and the walled South Garden of Coverdale Court, valued at the home pasture rental at £400. The matter was discussed at a private interview, the late Mrs. Coverdale being then in her settled mind, and Sir Roderick being then at the South Library at her invitation. Sir Roderick shall set out the conversation in his own hand." Mr. Aubrey inclined his head at Sir Roderick at the gentle Salisbury degree. "Sir Roderick," he said, "pray proceed." Sir Roderick laid his hand at the gold-headed cane and drew the linen handkerchief from his primrose silk waistcoat pocket and dabbed at his gout-flushed forehead in a manner that was meant to suggest the steady recollection of a gentleman of long acquaintance. "Miss Coverdale," he said, "Mr. Aubrey, Reverend. The matter is at my own settled remembrance, and I shall set it out at the plain country fashion. In the September of 1818, the second Wednesday of the month, by my own pocket-book, I was at Coverdale Court by Mrs. Philippa Coverdale's own invitation. I had carried up the cutting of the white-flowered jasmine she had asked at me from the Bridges Hall Conservatory in the August preceding. Mr. Sandys Hadley brought me up to the South Library, where the late Mrs. Coverdale was at this very writing-table at which Miss Coverdale now sits. He paused. He folded the linen handkerchief. He laid it at his knee. The conversation, he said, fell at the Latin poets. Mrs. Coverdale had her pine-press Virgil at her hand at this writing-table. She read me a line, in her own steady voice, from Virgil's Eclogue 6, line 27. The line was, "I have it at my own pocket-book, and at my own settled remembrance. Iste Deo lumen demergit aquis." About Apollo, as she said, that Apollo should plunge his light at the waters at the close of the day. She put the line at me as the figure of the South Orangery, the plants closing at the close of the day, the gathered light of the South Library at the close of the year. And she said that the South Orangery and the walled South Garden, being her own particular labour these 28 years past, should at her own settled wish be at my hand at Bridges Hall, where I had set up the white-flowered jasmine from her cutting at my own conservatory. We discussed the matter at the South Library at her invitation, and the parole trust was set up between us at that hearing in the September of 1818. Mr. Inchbald inclined his head at Mr. Aubrey. Sir Roderick's own settled remembrance, he said, is at the pocketbook entry of the 2nd Wednesday of September 1818 and at the conversation at the South Library at Coverdale Court. Mr. Aubrey shall observe that a parole trust of land at the testator's own hand at her settled mind, evidenced at a conversation of the kind set out, is at the equity of the Court of Chancery, a matter the heiress shall not lightly set aside. We ask, on Sir Roderick's instruction, that Miss Coverdale at the writing-table this morning accept the parole trust at the South Orangery and the walled South Garden in Sir Roderick's favour, and that the matter be set down at Mr. Aubrey's hand at Salisbury at the proper instrument. Mr. Aubrey did not reply at once. He laid his gold spectacles at the writing-table at his right hand. He looked at Charlotte across the table at the steady Salisbury manner that had been his usage with Mrs. Philippa 28 years. "Miss Coverdale," he said, "you have heard Sir Roderick's matter. You shall make your reply at your own settled hand." Charlotte laid her hand at the half-title of the Pine Press, 1763 folio. She did not look at Sir Roderick. She did not look at Mr. Inchbald. She looked at the writing-table and at the Virgil folio at her hand, and at the Le Maire 1817 tabulus at her left, and the steady Wiltshire composure of the South Parlour at the parsonage and the South Library at Coverdale was at her own settled keeping. "Sir Roderick," she said, "the line you have quoted is not from Virgil's Eclogue 6. It is from Tibulus's Elegies Book 2 Poem 6. The Pine Press 1763 Virgil at this table, and the Le Maire 1817 Tibullus at my hand will both confirm. The matter you set out cannot have been at the source you set it out." The South Library at the writing-table held the long Wiltshire silence of the chalk downs at the close of a winter morning. The fire at the hearth gave out one small fall of coal at the brass dogs. Mr. Aubrey did not move. The Reverend Walpole Tregony did not move. Mr. Inchbald's thin grey hand at the folded paper of 3 sheets did not move. Sir Roderick said nothing. His gout-flushed forehead held the linen handkerchief's mark. His oily smile was at the corner of his mouth and at none of the rest of his face. His gold-headed cane at the floor at his right knee was at the silence of an instrument that had not been called. Charlotte drew the Pine Press 1763 Virgil folio to the middle of the writing-table and turned the folio at Eclogue 6. The paper was the Pine Press laid paper of 1763, soft at the gentle fingering of 57 years, the Wiltshire italic of her late great-aunt at the margin of every eclogue from I to X. Charlotte set her hand at the page-head, P. Virgili Maronis Bucolica, Ecloga Sexta. She set her finger at the running count of the lines at the inner margin in her late great-aunt's gentle italic, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, at the page. She set her finger at line 27. "Sir Roderick," she said, "the Pine Press, 1763 Virgil folio is at the writing-table at line 27 of Eclogue 6. The line at the folio reads, Tum vero in numerum faunosque ferasque videres. The line concerns the fawns and the wild beasts dancing in measure at Silenus's song, at the company of the satyrs at the cave. The line does not concern Apollo. The line does not concern the plunging of light at waters. The Pine Press folio is at the writing-table, and the line shall stand at your own reading." She turned the folio at Sir Roderick at the writing-table. Sir Roderick did not lean at the folio. Mr. Inchbald inclined at the folio at the thin grey movement of a barrister, called at a citation his clerk has not verified. He read the line. He laid the folio back at the middle of the writing-table without observation. Charlotte drew her own third quarto notebook of English verse translation of the Eclogues. the notebook covering Eclogue's 5 to 7s, kept at her own hand at the parsonage south parlour, 1817 to 1819, and opened it at Eclogue 6. The verse translation at the page was in her gentle italic at the right-hand column, the Latin at the left-hand column, the verse numbering at the inner margin, to the count at the Pine Press, 1763 folio. At line 27 of my own verse translation, she said, I have rendered, then verily in measure both fawns and wild things you should see dancing. The translation is at my own hand, and the rendering shall stand at your own reading. The line at the Pine Press 1763 folio of Virgil, and the line at the third quarto notebook of my own English verse translation agree at the same Latin and at the same Apollo's absent matter. She turned the third quarto notebook at Sir Roderick at the writing table. Sir Roderick did not lean at the notebook. Mr. Inchbald inclined at the notebook at the thin grey movement of a barrister who has read the citation at the folio and at the verse translation, and is at the moment of the matter at his settled silence. Charlotte drew the Le Maire 1817 Tibullus from the writing stand at her left hand. The small octavo was in plain marbled paper boards with the gilt Morocco label at the spine, Tivoli Elegiae, and the half-title at her hand read Albii Tivoli Equitis Romani Opera Parisius Apud N.E. Le Maire MDCCCC 17th. She opened at Book 2, Poem 6. The page head ran Tivoli Liber Secundus Elegia Sexta Castra Maker Sequitur. She set her finger at the inner margin running count, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, at the page, at line 25 at the print, and the line above and the line below. Sir Roderick, she said, the line you have quoted, Ista Deo Lumen demerget aquis, is at Tibulus's Elegies book, 2 Poem 6. It is at the elegy Castra Macer Sequitur. It is not at any work of Virgil's. The elegy is the lamentation of the poet at Macer's departure for the wars. The line concerns the cup the poet shall lift at the gathered wine of morning, and the god to whom the light shall be plunged at the waters at the elegy's close, in the Tibullus fashion of mourning. The matter is not at Apollo, at any reading I have at my own hand. She turned the Le Maire 1817 Tibullus at Sir Roderick at the writing table. Sir Roderick did not lean at the small octavo. Mr. Inchbald inclined at the small octavo at the thin grey movement of a barrister whose instructing client has set out a citation at a poem the client has not read. Sir Roderick, Charlotte said, my late great-aunt, Mrs. Philippa Coverdale, was at the Eclogues of Virgil from 1796 until the December of 1819. She did not read it Tibullus at any setting at the South Library of Coverdale Court. The Le Maire 1817 Tibullus at the writing stand is at my own hand, brought up from the parsonage at the 8th of January 1820 at the small box of my own books. There is no copy of Tibullus at the South Library shelves at Coverdale Court, at any inventory at my late great-aunt's commonplace book at any year. The line you have quoted as Virgil's Eclogue 6 is at a poem, at a poet, at a copy, not at the South Library, at any private interview at the September of 1818. The matter you set out cannot have been at the source you set it out. She laid the Le Maire 1817 Tibullus back at the writing stand at her left hand. She laid her own third quarto notebook at the writing table at her right hand. She laid her hand at the half-title of the Pine Press, 1763 folio at the gentle italic of her late great-aunt at the matter of P. Coverdale, Coverdale Court, the 4th of August 1779, by Mr. Marmaduke Coverdale's gift from the Pine Sale in London. She did not speak again. The fire at the hearth gave out one further small fall of coal at the brass dogs. The chalk downs at the south orangery glass, beyond the south window, held the thin Wiltshire light of a morning at the second half of January, in the Vale of Pusey, and the South Library at the writing table held the long settled silence at the close of the matter Sir Roderick had brought up from Bridges Hall. Sir Roderick laid the linen handkerchief at his face. He did not dab. He held it at his face for a count of 7 Wiltshire seconds at the long case clock at the north wall, and at the close of the 7 seconds he lowered the linen handkerchief at his knee, and the oily smile at the corner of his mouth was gone, and the gout-flushed forehead was a sheet of pale Wiltshire winter, and the primrose silk waistcoat at his stout 5'10" was at the small, unmistakable collapse of a deviser's baronet whose pocketbook entry at the second Wednesday of September 1818 had been set out at a citation that had not been at any reading at any South Library, at any Wiltshire manor, at any year of the 28 years past. "Mr. Inchbald," he said. Mr. Inchbald did not look at Sir Roderick. He laid the folded paper of 3 sheets sewn at the left margin with the plain black silk of the Lincoln's Inn fashion at the plain black portfolio. He fastened the brass clasp at the portfolio at the small Lincoln's Inn. Click of a matter at its close. He laid the portfolio at the small side table at his right hand. He rose at the chair at the south side of the writing table. "Mr. Aubrey," he said. On the citation at the South Library of Coverdale Court, as set out, Mr. Inchbald of Lincoln's Inn withdraws Sir Roderick's parole claim at the South Orangery and the walled South Garden. Mr. Inchbald shall lodge no further instrument at Salisbury at the matter. Sir Roderick shall be at his barouche at the south door. Mr. Aubrey inclined his head at Mr. Inchbald at the gentle Salisbury degree of a matter settled at the South Library writing table at the proper hearing. "Mr. Inchbald," he said. Mr. Aubrey of High Street, Salisbury, accepts the withdrawal at Mr. Inchbald's hand on behalf of Sir Roderick Bridges. The matter shall be set down at Mr. Aubrey's chambers at Salisbury at this day's date, with the disinterested witness of the Reverend Walpole Tregony of St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale, at the heiress's hand and at the estate's hand, that no further citation at the matter shall stand against Coverdale Court at any Wiltshire court at any year. Mr. Inchbald is a gentleman. Mr. Inchbald inclined at the writing table at the thin grey movement of a barrister, whose Lincoln's Inn courtesy at a citation at its close was at the South Library at the Wiltshire degree of the matter. "Miss Coverdale," he said. "Mr. Inchbald of Lincoln's Inn, your servant. The matter at the South Library is settled at your own hand." He withdrew at the South Library door. Mr. Sandys Hadley, at the flagged passage at the south door, took him through. Sir Roderick rose at the chair at the writing table. He did not look at Charlotte. He did not look at Mr. Aubrey. He did not look at the Reverend Walpole Tregony. He took up the gold-headed cane at the floor at his right knee. He laid the linen handkerchief at the primrose silk waistcoat pocket. He took up the plum frock coat at his stout 5'10" at the small fastening at the lapel. "Mr. Aubrey," he said, "Sir Roderick Bridges shall be at the south door." He did not give a parting civility. He turned at the writing table and walked at the South Library door at the gout-favoured step of a deviser's baronet, whose pocketbook entry of the second Wednesday of September 1818 had collapsed at Tibullus' Elegies Book 2, Poem 6 at the hand of the heiress of Coverdale Court. Mr. Sandys Hadley, at the south door, saw him to the barouche, the wheels at the gravel carried at the chalk-down lane to devises at the proper Wiltshire degree, and the South Library held the 3 at the writing table at the settled close of the matter. Mr. Aubrey took up his gold spectacles. He set them at his face. He looked at Charlotte across the writing table at the steady Salisbury manner that had been his usage with the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale. "Miss Coverdale," he said, "the matter is settled. The Virgil and the Tibullus have settled it." He took out the small plain pocketbook at the inner pocket of his dark wool, and the steel pen at the inkstand at her offered nod, and at the Salisbury hand set down the matter of the morning, the citation at Eclogue 6, line 27, the actual line at the pine press folio, the citation at Tibullus' Elegies Book 2, Poem 6, the withdrawal at Mr. Inchbald's hand on behalf of Sir Roderick, the disinterested witness of the Reverend Walpole Tregony, and the date. "I shall set down the instrument at Salisbury," he said. "Sir Roderick shall not return at the south door of Coverdale Court at any further citation." He closed the small plain pocket-book at the inner pocket of his dark wool. He laid the steel pen at the inkstand at Charlotte's right hand. He looked at the Reverend Walpole Tregony. "Reverend," he said, "I am at your obligation as the disinterested witness at the matter. The Greek Testament at your knee was the settled Wiltshire degree at the South Library writing table at the proper hearing. Mr. Aubrey of High Street, Salisbury, thanks you at the estate's hand." The Reverend Walpole Tregony inclined at the South Library chair at the gentle Wiltshire degree of a parish curate at his proper office at his proper parish. "Mr. Aubrey," he said, "the matter at the South Library was at the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale's settled wish at the South Library writing table. The parish curate's office at the disinterested witness was at no further matter than the late Mrs. Coverdale's settled wish. Miss Coverdale shall have the parish curate at the south porch of St. Michael's at any Sunday at the proper Wiltshire degree." He took up the Greek Testament at his knee. He laid it under his arm at the plain black gown. He rose at the South Library chair. "Miss Coverdale," he said, "I shall return to the parsonage at the proper hour." "Reverend Walpole Tregony," Charlotte said, "I am at your obligation at the South Library this morning. The parish curate's hand at the matter shall be at my own settled remembrance at the Wiltshire fashion of the Coverdale family." The Reverend Walpole Tregony inclined at the writing table at the gentle Wiltshire degree. He withdrew at the South Library door, at the flagged passage at the south door, and Mr. Sandys Hadley saw him to the rectory pony trap that had stood at the south drive. The South Library at the writing table held Mr. Aubrey and Charlotte at the gentle Wiltshire silence of a matter settled. Mr. Aubrey took up his small plain pocket-book at the inner pocket of his dark wool a second time. He set out at his Salisbury hand the further matter that the heiress of Coverdale Court should at her own settled hand keep at the South Library writing table, the Pine Press 1763 Virgil folio, the third quarto notebook of her own English verse translation of the Eclogues, and the Lemaire 1817 Tibullus, at the small offered cabinet at the South Library wall at her left hand, at the proper Wiltshire degree of a settled instrument at any further citation, at any further claim, at any further devises barouche, at any further Wednesday at the year. Charlotte gave the small inclined nod at her late great-aunt's Wiltshire fashion. "Miss Coverdale," Mr. Aubrey said, "the instrument shall be at your hand at the South Library writing table by Wednesday next, by the proper Salisbury post. The matter of Sir Roderick Bridges of Bridges Hall is closed at Coverdale Court." He inclined at the writing table at the Salisbury degree, and withdrew at the South Library door, at the flagged passage at the South Chamber. Mrs. Northmore had set out the evening before. The South Library at the writing table held Charlotte at her own hand at the Pine Press 1763 folio at Eclogue 6 at line 27 at her late great-aunt's italic. Mrs. Northmore came up at the green baize door at the small Wiltshire knock of a housekeeper at her settled hour. She came up at the small offered tray of plain Salisbury tea at the side table by the south window, and she laid the tray at the small offered table at Charlotte's right hand at the writing table without observation at the matter. And she did not speak at the writing table at the proper Wiltshire degree, and she did not look at the Pine Press 1763 folio at the writing table, or at the Lemaire 1817 Tibullus at the writing stand at Charlotte's left hand, and she withdrew at the green baize door at the small Wiltshire degree of a housekeeper at the South Library at the close of the matter. Charlotte laid her hand at the Pine Press 1763 folio at the half-title at her late great-aunt's gentle italic at the matter of P. Coverdale, Coverdale Court, the 4th of August, 1779. She did not weep at the italic at this writing table at this Wednesday, at the second half of January, in the Vale of Pewsey. She had set out at the writing table the matter at the proper citation, at the proper folio, at the proper notebook, at the proper octavo. She had kept the Pine Press 1763 folio at her late great-aunt's settled wish at the proper Coverdale fashion, and the South Orangery and the walled South Garden should not be at any Bridges Hall, hand at any further pocketbook entry at any further year. She took up the small offered tea at her right hand at the writing table. She drank at the proper Wiltshire degree. She set the cup at the small offered table at her right hand. She drew the third quarto notebook of her own English verse translation at the writing table at her right hand, and opened the notebook at Eclogue 6, at the page, at the line at her own gentle italic at the inner margin. She took up the steel pen at the inkstand at her right hand, and she set down at the small Wiltshire degree of an entry at the inner margin at line 27 of Eclogue 6, at the South Library writing table, Coverdale Court, Wednesday the 19th of January 1820. The line shall stand at the Pine Press 1763 folio, at the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale's gentle italic at the inner margin, and at this notebook at my own English verse translation. C.C. She laid the steel pen at the inkstand. She closed the third quarto notebook with the thin slip of plain Wiltshire writing paper at the place. She laid her hand at the half-title of the Pine Press 1763 folio, at her late great-aunt's italic, and the South Library held the long-settled Wiltshire silence at the chalk downs at the close of a winter morning in the Vale of Pewsey, at the year of our Lord, 1820. The late January at Coverdale settled into a careful rhythm that took Charlotte between the South Library at the Court and the parsonage at Coverdale on the Vale, 8 miles west. She kept Mondays at the parsonage with her widowed father, the Reverend Hadrian Coverdale, who held the curacy of St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale, as he had these 22 years past. She kept Tuesdays for the Coverdale parish poor, with Mrs. Northmore at the housekeeper's keys. She kept Wednesdays for the home pasture accounts, with Mr. Verney at the steward's strong cupboard. She kept Thursdays for the South Library writing table at the 1763 Pine Press Virgil folio her late great-aunt had kept at the writing table since the pine sale in London of 1779. She kept Fridays for the South Library at her own three-quarto notebooks of the Eclogue translations she had kept these 4 years past. She kept Saturdays for the parish school English poetry class at the South Library, with the 6 village girls Reverend Walpole Tregony had laid at her hand at the rectory tea of the second Sunday of January. She kept Sundays for St. Michael's at the south porch of Coverdale, and the rectory tea following with the Reverend Walpole Tregony in the gentle Wiltshire fashion that the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale had kept in her own day. In the first week of February, Mrs. Northmore at the Brick Hob proposed Miss Phoebe Northmore, her niece of 24 at Pewsey Village, as reading companion to the new mistress of Coverdale. Miss Phoebe Northmore was a small, fair, Pewsey-bred young woman of plain dark wool and a settled honesty, and Charlotte accepted her at the South Library on the Thursday following. Miss Phoebe took up her reading at the South Library window, in the afternoons of the Thursdays and the Fridays, sitting at the small dark oak reading chair the late Mrs. Philippa had kept at the south wall, and she read aloud from the Reverend Mr. Henry Hart Milman's Fall of Jerusalem of 1820, and from Miss Hannah More's Practical Piety of 1811, in the plain, Pewsey-bred reading voice her aunt had set her to from her own girlhood. Charlotte, at the South Library writing table, laid the 1763 Pine Press Virgil folio at the writing table and listened to the reading at the gentle Wiltshire afternoon hour, and the matter of the reading companion was settled at the South Library in the careful manner of the late Mrs. Philippa's own day. The 6 Coverdale village girls of the Saturday English poetry class were named once at the Reverend Walpole Tregony's parish school list in the South Library hand of Charlotte herself. Hetty Sandys at 13, the steward tenant's youngest daughter at the Chalkdown farm. Patience Verney at 12, the steward's eldest at the home pasture cottage. Damaris Northmore at 14, the housekeeper's grandniece at Pewsey. Letitia Walpole Tregony at 11, the curate's middle daughter at the rectory. Faith Aubrey at 12, the Salisbury solicitor's grandniece, lodging with her aunt at the village, and Sophie Inchbald at 13, the village schoolmistress's daughter, no relation to the deviser's barrister. These were the 6 who came over from the village on the Saturday afternoons, through the late winter and the gentle Wiltshire spring. The parish school English poetry class at the South Library on the Saturday afternoons was, in Charlotte's own settled understanding of the matter, the chief expansion of her late great-aunt's settled wish at the South Library writing table. She had the 6 village girls at the South Library at the dark oak reading table from the early afternoon through the close of the afternoon, and she taught them, in the careful Wiltshire fashion her own father had kept at the parsonage south parlour of her own girlhood, the pastoral imagery of the English versions she had drawn at her own 3/4 notebooks from the Latin of the Eclogues. She read out at the dark oak reading table the English of Eclogue, at the opening pastoral of Tityrus at the beech tree shade, the English of Eclogue the Fourth at the messianic line, "He shall see the life of gods." She had set down at her own quarto notebook the Sing, at the parsonage south parlour of the December past, the English of Eclogue 5, at the elegy for Daphnis at the Shepherd's Stone, and the English of Eclogue 7th, at the singing match at the Chalkdown meadow. She set Hetty Sandys and Patience Verney at the pastoral imagery of the shepherd's beech tree shade, Damaris Northmore and Letitia Walpole Tregony at the pastoral imagery of the elegy for Daphnis at the stone, and Faith Aubrey and Sophie Inchbald at the pastoral imagery of the singing match at the Chalkdown meadow. The 6 village girls each took up a small homemade copybook of plain Salisbury woolcloth at the cover that Mrs. Northmore at the housekeeper's keys had set up for the class at the South Press at the upper landing, and they began at the South Library reading table their own small copybooks of the English pastoral verse, copying down at the small reading table the English versions Charlotte read out at the dark oak in her own gentle Wiltshire reading voice. The class closed at the close of the afternoon, with Mrs. Northmore at the brick hob bringing in the milk and honey at the South Library, and the 6 village girls walking back at Mr. Verney's careful direction at the home pasture path to the village. Charlotte at the South Library writing table at the close of each Saturday set down in her own green calf English poetry journal the pastoral imagery the 6 village girls had taken at the class hour, and the small Coverdale Parish School English Poetry Register the Reverend Walpole Tregony had laid at her hand at the rectory tea of the 2nd Sunday of January was kept at the South Library writing table at the plain Wiltshire fashion the late Mrs. Philippa had kept of her own parish school accounts at the Coverdale living in her own day. The parish school English poetry class at the South Library on the Saturday afternoons through the late winter and the early spring took up the pastoral imagery of Eclogues 1, Ashvi, Vi, and 7th at the 26 Saturday hours from the 2nd Saturday of January through the last Saturday of April, and by the close of the April, the 6 village girls of the Coverdale parish had each a small homemade copybook of pastoral verse drawn from Charlotte's English versions at her own 3/4 notebooks of the Eclogue translations of 1815 onward. Mr. Verney walked the home pasture at his usual rounds through the late February and the early March, and reported the lambing at the Chalkdown meadow as fair for the year. The steward's strong cupboard rentals at the plain Wiltshire, reckoning of the late Mrs. Philippa's own books, these many years past. The Wednesday of the 22nd of March, 1820 came in upon Coverdale with the soft Wiltshire light of an early spring afternoon at the South Library window, and Charlotte, at the South Library writing table, opened her late great-aunt's 3 unfinished quarto notebooks of the Eclogue II translation at the first of the 3 at the first page entry. She had not before opened the first page of the late great-aunt's own first quarto, having read through the inner pages of the 3 quartos at the South Library writing table of the late January, at the close of the Sir Roderick matter, and read down the Latin of Eclogue the Cygne at her own quarto notebook I, at the dark oak reading table at the South Library window of the February. The first quarto notebook of Mrs. Philippa's Eclogue the Second was a plain dark calf quarto of Salisbury 1796, with the gentle italic of Mrs. Philippa Coverdale at every page, and Charlotte read through twice the marginal note at the first page entry at the upper right of the page in the gentle italic of her late great-aunt's own hand. Begun this 4th of May, 1796, at the gentle Wiltshire morning of dear Hadrian's marriage, to my niece Sarah Pusey, at St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale. The verse translation of Eclogue II shall be my own labour against the years that have separated us. P.C. The 4th of May, 1796, was the morning of her own father's marriage at St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale to her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Pusey Coverdale. The marriage Charlotte had heard of at the parsonage south parlour these many years past in her father's plain Wiltshire reserve, at the small-framed Salisbury miniature of 1796 at the south parlour writing desk. Her late great-aunt, Mrs. Philippa Coverdale, had begun the Eclogue II translation at the morning of her parents' wedding as her own labour of asking pardon for the parting of 1788 between Sir Geoffrey Coverdale and his younger brother, her late uncle, Mr. Marmaduke Coverdale, at the Reverend Augustus Coverdale of Devizes's hand. Mrs. Philippa had laboured at the Eclogue II translation at the South Library writing table from the May of 1796 through to the autumn of 1810, the autumn of her husband Sir Geoffrey's death at Coverdale Court, and had left the 3 quarto notebooks unfinished at the close page entry of the autumn of 1810, in the gentle italic of her own widowed hand. She had laboured at the Eclogue II translation at the South Library writing table these 14 years against the 8 Wiltshire miles between Coverdale and the Coverdale on the Vale parsonage that she had not in her own widowhood brought herself to cross, and she had set down at the first page entry of the first quarto her own settled understanding that the labour was the labour of asking pardon at the morning of dear Hadrian's marriage to her niece Sarah Pusey. The shared trait of the Eclogue translation at the South Library writing table at Coverdale Court, squared at the South Library across the 25 years between her late great-aunt's first page entry of the 4th of May, 1796, and her own quarto notebook 4 of the spring of 1820, at the South Library writing table. Charlotte closed the 3rd quarto at the close page entry of the autumn of 1810, and stood at the South Library window in the soft Wiltshire light of the early spring afternoon, in a settled silence of 10 minutes. The South Library window gave at the home pasture and the apple and pear orchard, and the walled south garden at the east, and the soft Wiltshire light of the early spring afternoon stood at the South Library writing table, at the 3 unfinished quarto notebooks of Mrs. Philippa's Eclogue Descent, at the first page entry of the 4th of May, 1796. Mrs. Northmore, at the brick hob in the kitchen at the south passage, was silent at the housekeeper's keys. The 1763 pine press Virgil folio at the South Library writing table stood open at the Eclogue II page at the dark oak. Charlotte, at the South Library writing table, took up her own quarto notebook IV of the spring of 1820 at the dark oak reading table at the South Library window, and copied down at the central crease of her own quarto 4 in her own gentle italic the first page entry of Mrs. Philippa's first quarto of the 4th of May, 1796, in the plain Wiltshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept at the South Library writing table at her own first-page entry. She set the 3/4 of Mrs. Philippa at the South Library writing table at the close of the entry, and laid her own 4/4 at the central crease at the dark oak reading table. The matter of the first-page entry of the 4th of May, 1796, at the South Library writing table was settled at Coverdale at the close of the Wednesday afternoon of the 22nd of March in the plain Wiltshire reckoning of the Chalkdown parishes. The Wednesday of the 12th of April brought the Reverend Walpole Tregony over from the rectory to the South Library tea, and he confirmed, in his Wiltshire reserve at the South Library window, that Mrs. Philippa Coverdale, at her last conversation at her south bedchamber in the November of 1819, had asked him to bring my small Pusey candle, the late Mrs. Philippa's own settled name for Charlotte, at the Coverdale on the Vale parsonage these many years past. The first-page entry of the 4th of May, 1796, at the first quarto of the Eclogue Tattoo. Translation: with my settled asking pardon. The Reverend Walpole Tregony had meant to speak of the matter at the South Library at the close of January, and had let the parsonage to Coverdale settling and the Sir Roderick matter of the South Library at the Wednesday of the 19th of January pass first. He asked Charlotte's pardon for the plain Wiltshire delay. The Reverend Walpole Tregony observed at the South Library window, in his plain Coverdale parish curate's manner, that the late Mrs. Philippa had at the south bedchamber asked him to lay the matter at Charlotte's hand at the South Library at the parish curate's own settled discretion, and that she had asked him further to say at the South Library, in her own settled wording at the south bedchamber, that the 8 Wiltshire Chalkdown miles between Coverdale and the Coverdale on the Vale parsonage had been at her hand to bridge from the spring of 1796 onward, the spring of Mrs. Sarah Pusey Coverdale's marriage to dear Hadrian at St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale. That she had not, in the matter of the Reverend Augustus Coverdale of Devizes and the parting of 1788, brought herself to the bridge, and that the Eclogue the Sedu translation at the 3/4 notebooks at the South Library writing table of 1796 to 1810. The labour of asking pardon at the morning of dear Hadrian's marriage to her niece Sarah Pusey was the labour she had meant the small Pusey candle to take up at tea. He South Library writing table in her own time. Charlotte received the Reverend Walpole Tregony's confirmation at the South Library window in her own settled silence, and asked the Reverend Walpole Tregony to take the South Library tea in the plain Wiltshire fashion that her late great-aunt had kept at the South Library on the rectory tea Wednesdays of her own day, Mrs. Northmore at the brick hob at the South Passage laying the small Coverdale tea service of 1791 at the South Library writing table, and the rectory tea of the Wednesday of the 12th of April was taken at the South Library window in the plain Wiltshire fashion of the Chalkdown parishes. Lady Day, Quarter Day at the 25th of March, brought Mr. Verney to the South Library writing table with the home pasture accounts and the steward's strong cupboard rentals settled at the plain Wiltshire reckoning of the late Mrs. Philippa's own books, the rentals of the Coverdale Chalkdown parish tenancies at the home pasture, and the apple and pear orchard, and the walled south garden, brought up at the plain steward's hand of his 30 years at the Coverdale living in the plain fashion her late great-aunt had kept of the Lady Day Quarter Day these many years past. In the middle of April, Mrs. Northmore at the housekeeper's keys brought up the Coverdale family pearls, a single strand of small Salisbury-set river pearls of 1789, in a worn dark calf case. The Coverdale pearls Sir Geoffrey Coverdale had set at the Salisbury goldsmiths for his bride, Mrs. Philippa Coverdale, at the spring of 1789. The pearls Mrs. Philippa had kept at the upper press at the South Landing through her widowhood of 1810 to 1819, and laid them on the South Library writing table at Charlotte's own settled wish, the worn dark calf case Set at the South Library writing table at the close of the afternoon in the plain Wiltshire fashion of the Chalkdown parishes, the late Mrs. Philippa had kept of the Coverdale family pearls these many years past. The Wednesday of the 12th of April, at the South Library, at the close of the English Poetry Class Hour, the 6 village girls presented Charlotte at the South Library window with a small calf-bound wildflower album of the Wiltshire Chalkdown meadows the 6 girls had gathered through the early spring at the South Meadow and the apple and pear orchard, and the village schoolmistress Mrs. Inchbald Pusey's own well-used copy of Mr. Croxall's 1722 Aesop's Fables in plain Salisbury woolcloth at the cover. The wildflower album laid at the writing table at Charlotte's hand by Hetty Sandys at the close of the class hour. By the late April, the half-mourning at Coverdale had eased by the gentle Wiltshire reckoning of the 4 months past the December of 1819, and Mrs. Northmore at the housekeeper's keys produced from the late Mrs. Philippa's South Press at the upper landing a cream and peach sprigged muslin morning gown of the Salisbury dressmaker's hand of 1818 that Mrs. Philippa had not lived to take into wear. Charlotte took the muslin into wear at the South Library at the close of the month, in the gentle Wiltshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day, the unrelieved black gabardine set by at the upper press. Easter Sunday at the 23rd of April 1820 came in upon Coverdale on the Vale of Pusey, in the soft Wiltshire light of the late April morning at St. Michael's. Reverend Walpole Tregony preached the Easter sermon from the Epistle of the Morning in his plain Wiltshire fashion at the south pulpit of St. Michael's. Mr. Sandys Hadley, at the south door of the church, had received the parish at the south porch in the early morning, and Mrs. Northmore at the Coverdale pew at the south aisle had laid the Coverdale pew cushions at the dark oak. Charlotte at the Coverdale pew, in her cream and peach sprigged muslin, and a small sprig of early Wiltshire chalk-down thyme at the bodice, took the parish Easter service in the gentle Wiltshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept at this pew these many years past. After the close of the service, the parish came out at the south porch of St. Michael's, into the soft Wiltshire light of the Easter Sunday late morning, and Reverend Walpole Tregony at the south porch inclined to a tall, lean, honey-fawn-coated gentleman who had stood at the rear of the south aisle through the service and who had come forward at the close to the south porch. The 5th Baron Walpole was tall, lean 6'1", dark chestnut hair lately silvering, warm hazel eyes the colour of Wiltshire honey, gentle firm mouth, weathered fair Oxford-trained skin, honey-fawn morning coat over cream waistcoat. Reverend Walpole Tregony at the south porch inclined to Charlotte and inclined to his lordship, and made the introduction in his settled Wiltshire fashion verbatim at the south porch of St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale of Pusey. Miss Coverdale, my cousin, his lordship Percival Aubrey Walpole, 5th Baron Walpole, of Walpole Court, 10 miles north on the Chalk Downs above Pusey. Lord Walpole is the lay patron of the Coverdale, living these 8 years past, and a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries these 5 years past. Lord Walpole at the south porch inclined to Charlotte in the Oxford-trained Wiltshire fashion of the Chalkdown parishes. He observed, at the south porch in his settled plain manner, that he had known the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale from the year of his own coming down to Walpole Court in 1812 through to her last autumn of 1819 as the considered Wiltshire classical scholar of the Chalkdown parishes, that Mrs. Philippa's settled understanding of the Eclogues of Virgil had been the chief classical observation of the Chalkdown country for the 8 years he had been at the lay patronage of the Coverdale living. He observed at the south porch in his Oxford-trained manner that he had been moved at the December bereavement of the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale at the close of the year past, and had laid his own small condolence at the rectory at the 2nd week of December at the Reverend Walpole Tregony's hand. He observed that at the parish school inspection of the September of 1819, the Reverend Walpole Tregony had laid at his hand at the rectory study one of Mrs. Philippa's own Eclogue II quarto notebook pages of the spring of 1810, and that he had, at the time, remarked at the Reverend Walpole Tregony's hand the Oxford quality observation of the verse translation, the cross-reference Mrs. Philippa had set down at the margin to the parallel pastoral imagery at the Eclogue 7th singing match, the suggested English of the shepherd's beech-tree shade at the opening, and the marginal note at the Latin idiom at the close of the page that Lord Walpole had not before seen at any of the Wiltshire chalk-down classical scholars' hands. He observed, in his plain Wiltshire manner at the south porch, that he had not in his 8 years at the lay patronage of the Coverdale living expected to see that hand continue at the South Library writing table after the December of 1819, and that the matter of the parish school English poetry class at the South Library at the Saturday afternoons through the late winter and the early spring had been brought to his hand at the rectory by the Reverend Walpole Tregony at the 3 Sunday rectory teas past. He observed further at the south porch, in his Oxford-trained Wiltshire manner, that his own privately printed translations from the Eclogues at Oxford of the year 1815, in 67 pages of his own Oxford Magdalen hand, had been at his writing table these 5 years past, and had not before found a Wiltshire chalk-down reader of the Pine Press 1763 Virgil of the considered understanding the late Mrs. Philippa had kept in her own day. Charlotte at the south porch, in her cream and peach sprigged muslin and the small sprig of early Wiltshire, chalk-down time at the bodice, received Lord Walpole's settled observation in the gentle Wiltshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day at this porch. She inclined to his lordship in the manner of the Coverdale on the Vale parsonage of her own girlhood. She replied at the south porch in her own settled trait, in the plain Wiltshire fashion of the chalk-down parishes. Lord Walpole, the Eclogues at Coverdale, I shall continue at my late great-aunt's settled wish. Lord Walpole at the south porch inclined to Charlotte at the close of her sentence, in the Oxford-trained Wiltshire fashion that the chalk-down parishes had known of the lay patron of the Coverdale, living these 8 years past, and observed that he was glad of the matter, and that he should hope to make his settled call at the South Library at Coverdale at the Tuesday following the close of Easter week, if the new mistress of the court should receive him at the South Library at the gentle Wiltshire hour the late Mrs. Philippa had kept for her own Tuesday calls in her own day. Charlotte at the south porch, in the soft Wiltshire light of the Easter Sunday late morning, inclined to Lord Walpole and replied that she should receive Lord Walpole at the South Library at the Tuesday call the late great-aunt had kept in her own day. And the matter at the south porch was settled in the plain Wiltshire fashion of the chalk-down parishes. Reverend Walpole Tregony at the south porch walked Charlotte and Lord Walpole to the Lich Gate of St. Michael's at the south churchyard wall, where the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale's plain Salisbury-set memorial stone of December 1819 stood at the south wall at the third grave from the Lich Gate in the plain Wiltshire fashion the chalk-down parishes had kept of the Coverdale family these many years past. Lord Walpole at the Lich Gate took his leave of Reverend Walpole Tregony and of Charlotte in the Oxford-trained Wiltshire fashion, inclining to the lay patron's own settled understanding of the matter, and walked at the south churchyard path to the Walpole court carriage that had stood at the rectory wall through the close of the service. Charlotte at the Lich Gate took her own leave of Reverend Walpole Tregony in the plain Wiltshire fashion of the chalk-down parishes, and walked back at the Wiltshire south churchyard path to the south door of Coverdale Court, Mrs. Northmore at the housekeeper's keys, 3 paces behind in her plain plum bombazine and her settled lace cap, in the soft Wiltshire light of the Easter Sunday, late morning at the close of the parish service. The south churchyard path from the Lich Gate of St. Michael's to the south door of Coverdale Court took the half-mile of Wiltshire chalk-down meadow at the south edge of the home pasture, past the small footbridge at the Chalkdown stream and the apple and pear orchard at the east of the walled south garden. In the plain Wiltshire fashion, the Coverdale family had walked at the Easter Sundays of these many years past. Charlotte, at the south door of Coverdale Court, inclined to Mrs. Northmore at the housekeeper's keys at the close of the half-mile, and Mrs. Northmore at the housekeeper's keys at the south door, took the cream and peach sprigged muslin bonnet at the inner hall in the plain Wiltshire fashion of the late Mrs. Philippa's own day. The Coverdale Parish Easter Sunday at the south door of the court was at the close in the settled Wiltshire fashion of the Chalkdown parishes, and the matter of the south porch at the Lich Gate at St. Michael's at the Easter Sunday of the 23rd of April was settled at Coverdale at the plain Wiltshire reckoning of the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale's own settled wish. Saturday the 6th of May, 1820 came in fair over the Vale of Pewsey, and the south door of Coverdale Court stood open to a Wiltshire morning of the kind Mrs. Philippa had loved at the close of her life. Charlotte Coverdale had laid her late great-aunt's annotated pine-press Virgil at the South Library writing-table, with the 3/4 notebooks of Mrs. Philippa's unfinished Eclogue de 2 beside it, and her own 3 completed quarto notebooks of Eclogues 1/4, V-Serve, and A-X at the inner edge of the table. She had set a small jug of Wiltshire bluebells at the lectern. Mrs. Northmore had aired the long south room since the early morning, and the brick hob held the kettle at the gentle simmer that Mrs. Philippa's housekeeper had kept these 30 years. At the close of the morning, the gravel of the south drive was taken by the wheels of Lord Walpole's chariot, and Mr. Sandys Hadley opened the south door to the party from Walpole Court. Lord Percival Aubrey Walpole came up the south steps first. Tall, lean 6'1", dark chestnut hair lately silvering, warm hazel eyes the colour of Wiltshire honey, gentle firm mouth, honey fawn morning coat over a cream waistcoat, and behind him his daughter, Lady Hester Walpole. Lady Hester was 8, with soft auburn hair under peach ribbons, warm hazel eyes, and a small white muslin pelisse. Lady Frances Walpole Inchbald followed, his married sister, 39, in plum silk and Brussels lace, her mouth gentle and considered. Mr. Quentin Inchbald handed her up the step, 44, fair-haired, plain dark wool, the easy Wiltshire civility of a Marlborough magistrate. The Dowager Lady Walpole came last on her son's arm, 66, small and upright, silver hair under a black lace cap, plain mourning silk, for her late daughter-in-law these 3 years past. Mrs. Northmore received the party at the South Hall in plum bombazine and a fresh lace cap, and showed them through to the South Library, where Charlotte stood at the inner side of the writing-table, in her cream and peach muslin half-mourning, her soft auburn hair plaited at the nape under a small lace cap, and the Coverdale pearls of Salisbury 1789 at her throat. The Dowager Lady Walpole took the south-facing chair at the brick hob, Lady Frances the cushioned chair beside her mother, Mr. Inchbald the writing chair at the inner table, Lord Walpole the upright chair at the lectern, and Lady Hester, with 8-year-old gravity, the small low stool that had been Mrs. Philippa's own, at the south window. Mrs. Northmore poured the tea from the silver Salisbury 1789 pot, and Charlotte handed the cups by her own hand to each in the Wiltshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept. The Dowager Lady Walpole spoke first, in the considered Wiltshire voice of a manor 66 years lived in. "Miss Coverdale, we have come over the 10 chalk miles from Walpole Court this morning, at my own son's settled wish, that I might at last see at the South Library the small Pewsey candle of whom our dear Mrs. Philippa wrote to me in October last. I am very gratified to find you at your great-aunt's writing-table, and the pine-press Virgil at your hand." Charlotte set the silver cream jug down. "Lady Walpole, Mrs. Philippa spoke of you to Mr. Aubrey in November. I am very honoured to receive you at the South Library this morning. Lady Frances inclined gently at the cushioned chair. My dear Miss Coverdale, my mother has not been over the 10 miles since the December bereavement, and Quentin and I have come down from Marlborough on purpose. The Eclogue notebooks at the writing table are the same hand my mother knew at Mrs. Philippa's writing table in 1815. Mr. Inchbald nodded at the inner table. Miss Coverdale, the matter at the parish school inspection last September was much spoken of at Marlborough Quarter Sessions. I am very gratified to see the Eclogues continuing at Coverdale. Lord Walpole had risen from the upright chair at the lectern and stood now at the inner edge of the writing table, where Charlotte's quarto notebook 3 lay open at Eclogue 6. He laid his weathered fair hand at the margin of the page and looked up at Charlotte with the warm hazel eyes that her own warm hazel eyes had met at the Easter porch a fortnight past. Miss Coverdale, he said, the South Library at Walpole Court has stood neglected since my late wife's death in the autumn of 1817. The classical translation desk at the south wall, where I had laid out at Oxford in 1803 my own first attempt at the Eclogues, has been closed these 3 years. I am asking now, in the gentle Wiltshire fashion of a neighbour 10 miles north on the Chalk Downs, whether you might lay out at the Walpole Court South Library a small classical translation demonstration of your Coverdale Eclogues at a Tuesday afternoon at your settled convenience, that my own daughter, Lady Hester, and my sister Lady Frances, and my mother the Dowager, might see at one Wiltshire afternoon what the pine-press Virgil at this table has set out. Charlotte laid her gentle hand at the inner margin of the writing table. Lord Walpole, I shall be very gratified to lay out the demonstration at the Walpole Court South Library at a Tuesday at your settled convenience. Lady Hester rose from the small low stool at the south window and crossed the South Library in 8-year-old gravity to the inner edge of the writing table where her father stood. She laid her small hand at the corner of the Eclogue 6 page. Miss Coverdale, she said, may I help with the Eclogue copybooks? Charlotte looked down at the soft auburn head and the peach ribbons and the warm hazel eyes that were her father's eyes in 8-year miniature. Lady Hester, I should be very glad of your hand at the Eclogue copybooks. The Dowager Lady Walpole inclined at the south-facing chair. Lady Frances laid her plum-silked hand at her mother's. Mr. Inchbald set down his teacup at the inner table, and Lord Walpole, at the inner edge of the writing table, did not say anything at all in the Wiltshire fashion of a South Library May morning. The Tuesday calls began the week following, and ran through the May fortnight and into the close of June. Reverend Hadrian Coverdale came over from the parsonage for the May fortnight, and sat at the second sash of the South Library, with his sewing, the plain dark Wiltshire mending of a curate's housekeeping, while his daughter and Lord Walpole laid Lord Walpole's own privately printed translations from the Eclogues at Oxford, Cirt Oxford, 1815, 67 pages, at the lectern between them. Lord Walpole had taken the verse translation of Eclogues the first, the third and seventh at his Magdalen years, with the considered guidance of Mr. Copleston the Provost of Oriel, and had laid the Latin parallel at the recto, and his own English at the verso in the careful italic of an Oxford classical hand. The Oxford binding was plain blue paper boards, with a small gilt rule at the spine, and the title page bore the Walpole arms above the date. Charlotte had not before considered his Tabulus and Virgil pages at Eclogue the Third. She set her own quarto notebook, I beside his Oxford folio at the lectern, and they read the parallel passages through the slow Wiltshire afternoon. He had not, at Magdalen in 1803, considered the Tibullus and Virgil distinction Charlotte had drawn against Sir Roderick at the South Library in the January past. He listened to the matter at the lectern, with his weathered fair hand at the inner margin, and inclined, and asked at the close of the hour whether she might set out at her own quarto 3, the careful note of the Tibullus, Elegies Book 2, Poem 6 against the Eclogue 6 verso of his own Oxford folio. Charlotte set out the note the Tuesday following in the careful italic of her late great-aunt's hand, and Lord Walpole bound it into his Oxford folio at the Walpole Court binding desk the Wednesday after. On the Tuesday of the 23rd of May, at the close of an hour at the lectern, Charlotte set down her quarto notebook, at the inner edge, and looked up to ask Lord Walpole the small Latin question she had laid by since the Wednesday previous, and caught his warm hazel eyes already at her own. One gentle moment, too late to look away. The Wednesday walks began that same week, and ran through the May fortnight and through June. Lord Walpole would come over the 10 chalk miles at the late morning on his fair bay Wiltshire mare, and they would take the south wall of the walled garden out to the home pasture, and along the south-east hedge to the dry stone wall at the head of the chalk down. Mr. Verney walked the home pasture at the same hour with the 2 Coverdale collies at his heel, and inclined as they passed at the orchard gate. On Wednesday the 7th of June, Lord Walpole stopped at the south-east corner of the dry stone wall, where the Wiltshire chalk-down thyme grew at the cold side of the chalk, above the small spring, and gathered a small sprig between his weathered fair hand and the upper stone. He turned, and gave it into Charlotte's hand in the Wiltshire silence of the open down. Charlotte laid the sprig at the inner edge of her own soft palm, and placed it in the linen pouch at her reticule, and they walked on to the home pasture without speaking. The chalk-down thyme was the Wiltshire stock Mrs. Philippa had set at the south wall in the soft May of 1796, against the years that had separated her from Mr. Marmaduke's house. In the last week of June, Lord Walpole asked, at the close of the Tuesday hour at the lectern, whether the Saturday calls at Coverdale might be requested at a settled hour the month following, that Lady Hester and Lady Frances and the Dowager might be over again from Walpole Court. Charlotte inclined at the inner edge of the writing-table, and said that the Saturday calls would be received at 3 at Coverdale through July. The Saturday calls came in through the July afternoons. On the Saturday of the 8th, Lady Hester brought her own small copybook of Eclogue Foyne, written out in her gentle 8-year-old italic at Walpole Court, and laid it at the lectern beside Charlotte's quarto notebook I. On the Saturday of the 15th, the Dowager Lady Walpole asked at the south-facing chair after the Coverdale pearls of Salisbury 1789, and Charlotte laid them at her gentle hand at the brick hob. On the Saturday of the 22nd, Lady Frances and Mr. Inchbald brought down their 2 daughters, Sophie and Mary, from Marlborough, and the South Library held 7 at the lectern between 3 and 5. And on the Saturday of the 29th, Lord Walpole laid at the inner edge of the writing-table his own Oxford 1815 translations from the Eclogues, with a small folded paper at the verso of page 11, a fair copied verse translation of Eclogue 5 lines 20 to 44, the Elegy for Daphnis, in his own gentle Oxford italic, set out for Charlotte's hand against the Elegy, at her own quarto notebook too. Saturday the 5th of August, 1820 came in fair to Coverdale at 3 of the afternoon. Lord Walpole had come over the 10 chalk miles at the late morning, and had sat at the South Library through the Eclogue hour at the lectern, and at the close had asked Charlotte whether she might take the south wall of the walled garden out to the small parlour rug at the south orangery. Mrs. Northmore had set the south orangery to the early August fashion of Mrs. Philippa's, with the small Persian parlour rug at the inner side of the orange tree, and a low Wiltshire seat at the cold flag. Lord Walpole stood at the inner edge of the parlour rug, and Charlotte at the cold flag at the inner side of the orange tree. He did not speak at the first long Wiltshire moment, and she did not speak. Then he laid his weathered fair hand at the inner margin of the small Wiltshire seat, and the warm hazel eyes that had met her own at the south-east corner of the dry stone wall on the 7th of June met her own again at the inner side of the orange tree at the South Orangery. "Miss Coverdale," he said, "I shall not lay this out in the Oxford fashion of a Magdalen address. I am 40, and I have been widowed at Walpole Court these 3 years. I am asking now, on no other ground than that I have read the gentle italic of your Eclogue translations these 4 months, and known by your late great-aunt's 1796 first-page entry that your hand is the next hand at the Coverdale Pine-Press Virgil, to do me the honour of becoming the next Lady Walpole. The South Library at Walpole Court shall stand at your hand, and the small classical translation desk at the south wall, and the soft Wiltshire afternoons of my daughter Lady Hester, and the chalk miles between Walpole Court and the Vale of Pewsey at every Wednesday open down. My own settled wish is that the Coverdale Pine-Press Virgil at the South Library shall continue at your great-aunt's writing table at every Tuesday hour, with Lady Hester at the small low stool at the south window, as Mrs. Philippa would have asked. I should be very honoured at your settled answer. I am asking at the inner side of this orange tree this Saturday afternoon." Charlotte laid her gentle hand at the inner margin of the small Wiltshire seat. "Lord Walpole, I shall." She looked up at his warm hazel eyes, at the cold flag at the inner side of the orange tree. "I shall. And I should be glad of the small Tuesday Eclogue hour at the South Library to continue, by Lady Hester's settled wish, even after the wedding bells of Coverdale." Lord Walpole did not move from the inner edge of the parlour rug at the first long Wiltshire moment. Then he inclined gently at the inner margin of the small Wiltshire seat. "My dear Miss Coverdale, I had not, until this Saturday minute at the parlour rug, foreseen the gentle Wiltshire quiet at the close of the Tuesday hour shall be the small candle of my own Walpole Court evenings to come. I am very gratified by your settled answer." Mrs. Northmore brought Lady Hester down from the South Library at the close of the South Orangery half-hour, and stood at the cold flag with her plum bombazined hand at the small auburn head. Lord Walpole turned at the inner edge of the parlour rug. "Hester, Miss Coverdale shall be the next Lady Walpole." Lady Hester took the news with the 8-year-old gravity of a Walpole Court daughter, and looked first at her father, and then at Charlotte at the cold flag at the inner side of the orange tree, and then at Mrs. Northmore at the inner margin of the South Orangery door. She crossed the small Persian parlour rug, and laid her small hand at Charlotte's gentle hand at the inner margin of the Wiltshire seat. "Miss Coverdale," she said, "I am very gratified. May I keep the small Tuesday Eclogue hour at the South Library at Coverdale, even after the wedding bells?" "Lady Hester, the small Tuesday Eclogue hour at the South Library at Coverdale shall keep, by your settled wish, even after the wedding bells." Lady Hester inclined at the inner margin of the Wiltshire seat in the considered fashion of her grandmother, the Dowager, and went back to Mrs. Northmore at the cold flag at the South Orangery door. The banns were called at St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale of Pewsey by Reverend Walpole Tregony on the Sundays of the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th of August. Mrs. Pewsey, the village dressmaker, came up to Coverdale through the last fortnight of August, a small, spare Wiltshire woman of 55, plain grey wool, her hair under a plain white cap, and laid out the cream Wiltshire muslin morning gown at the south parlour fitting-room, with her 2 apprentice nieces from the village. Saturday the 9th of September, 1820 came in fair to the Vale of Pewsey at the early autumn close of the summer. Charlotte rose at the south chamber at first light, and stood at the south casement at the close of the early hour, and watched the chalk downs open to the gentle Wiltshire morning. Mrs. Northmore came up at the close of the breakfast hour with the Coverdale pearls of Salisbury 1789, and the small silver locket that had been her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Pewsey Coverdale's, at the wedding of the 4th of May, 1796, at St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale. Mrs. Pusey came up at the close of the dressing hour with the cream Wiltshire muslin morning gown and the white and cream rose from the south orangery and the sprig of late summer Wiltshire chalk down thyme that Mr. Verney had gathered at the southeast corner of the dry stone wall at first light. A little before the bells, Mr. Aubrey came up the south steps of Coverdale Court in plain dark wool and his gold spectacles, and Charlotte came down the south stair on his civil arm. The cream Wiltshire muslin morning gown stood at her small 5'5" frame, the sprig of late summer Wiltshire chalk down thyme and the one white and cream rose were laid at the bodice. The Coverdale pearls of Salisbury, 1789, stood at her throat. The ivory silk gloves were at her gentle hands, and the small silver locket of her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Pusey Coverdale, was at the inner pocket of the morning gown, at the side of her gentle heart. The bells of St. Michael's were rung at 10 of the morning. Mr. Aubrey gave the bride away at the south door of the church. Reverend Hadrian Coverdale sat at the front pew of the nave in plain black wool, his weathered fair hand at the prayer book. His late wife, Mrs. Sarah Pusey Coverdale, had been given at her own confirmation at Salisbury in 1789. Reverend Walpole Tregony stood at the chancel in plain black gown. Lord Walpole stood at the chancel rail in honeyfawn wool over a cream waistcoat, with Mr. Inchbald at his right hand. Lady Hester sat at the second pew in cream muslin and peach ribbons. The Dowager Lady Walpole and Lady Frances Walpole Inchbald sat at the second pew at her hand. Mrs. Northmore and Mr. Sandys Hadley and Mr. Verney sat at the third pew. Miss Phoebe Northmore sat at the fourth. The 6 village girls, Hetty Sandys, Patience Verney, Damaris Northmore, Letitia Walpole Tregony, Faith Aubrey, and Sophie Inchbald sat at the 5th. Mrs. Pusey the village dressmaker sat at the 6th, at the inner side of the south aisle. The Vale of Pusey held quiet at the chalk downs above the south churchyard. Reverend Walpole Tregony read the marriage service of the Book of Common Prayer at the chancel, and Lord Walpole made his vow in the considered Wiltshire voice of a Walpole court manner, and Charlotte made her own in the gentle Wiltshire voice of a Coverdale on the Vale parsonage. The ring was given at Mr. Inchbald's hand. The register was signed at the vestry by the bride's gentle Wiltshire hand, Charlotte Walpole, formerly Coverdale, and by Lord Walpole's, and by Mr. Aubrey's, and by Reverend Hadrian Coverdale's, and by Reverend Walpole Tregony's. The bells of St. Michael's were rung at the close of the service. The wedding breakfast was laid at the south dining room at Coverdale Court at the close of the morning service. Mrs. Northmore had set the Salisbury 1789 plate at the long Wiltshire table. The 80-piece service that had been Mrs. Philippa's own at her wedding at Salisbury in 1788, and Mr. Sandys Hadley stood at the south door in plain dark wool. The long Wiltshire table held a small bowl of white and cream roses from the south orangery at the centre, and a sprig of late summer chalk down thyme at each cover, and the Coverdale silver candlesticks of Salisbury 1789 at the two ends. The party sat 16 at the table, with the bride and Lord Walpole at the head, and Reverend Hadrian Coverdale and the Dowager Lady Walpole at the foot, and Lady Hester at the bride's soft hand. Mr. Aubrey sat at Lord Walpole's right. Lady Frances and Mr. Inchbald sat at the bride's left. Reverend Walpole Tregony sat at Reverend Hadrian's right. The Wiltshire ham, and the late summer pear, and the cream, and the plain Coverdale honey, and the small game pie, and the cold cut of Wiltshire fowl were laid in the considered Wiltshire fashion of Mrs. Philippa's own house. Mrs. Northmore poured the chocolate from the silver Salisbury 1789 pot at the side table. The chalk downs held to the south. The Vale of Pusey opened soft at the south casement. Reverend Hadrian Coverdale rose at the close of the breakfast and laid out, in the considered Wiltshire voice of a curate, at the close of his 22nd year at St. Michael's, the small, careful blessing his own father, the Reverend Augustus Coverdale of Devizes, had laid out at his own wedding to Mrs. Sarah Pusey Coverdale at St. Michael's of Coverdale on the Vale on the 4th of May, 1796. The chariot from Walpole Court was brought up at the south door at the close of the breakfast, and the bride and Lord Walpole took the chalk road north for the 10 miles to Walpole Court at the close of the September day. If this gentle Wiltshire afternoon at Coverdale Court has rested at your hand, please tap the like and the subscribe, and tell me at the comments which Eclogue at the lectern at Coverdale you should have read first. Charlotte returned to Coverdale in the spring of 1821. She planted 3 Wiltshire chalk-down time cuttings at the south wall of the walled garden, as her late great-aunt had asked in her 1796 marginal note at the first page of the Eclogue II quarto notebook. The portrait of the late Mrs. Philippa Coverdale, Salisbury 1815, in plain dark Coverdale mourning, hung above the South Library fireplace. Mr. Verney continued at the home pasture, Mrs. Northmore at the housekeeper's keys. The Vale of Pewsey opened gentle to the chalk downs at the close of the spring afternoon. The estate was hers. In the gentle Wiltshire fashion her own late mother, Mrs. Sarah Pewsey Coverdale, had kept all her days.